The granite kitchen of the Blackstone estate gleamed under imported Venetian chandeliers, a monument to wealth where $5,000 knives had never touched an onion and restaurant-grade appliances sat pristine as museum pieces. For 29-year-old Isabella Vargas, it mostly smelled like emptiness. She had been the family's head housekeeper for 4 years, invisible among the marble columns and gold-leafed fixtures, watching a fractured family drift apart in their palace of isolation. But on this rain-soaked Thursday evening in November, as she taught 8-year-old Sophia Blackstone how to fold her bisabuela's secret tamales, she had no idea that one cherished family recipe would unearth a 20-year deception that had stolen her entire bloodline's culinary legacy and built a food empire worth $3 billion on the graves of her ancestors' dreams. The Blackstone mansion commanded the highest peak of Belmont Hills, its neo-Georgian facade overlooking the sprawling city of Richmond below. Behind its towering iron gates lived Alexander Blackstone III, whose culinary empire Heritage Foods International had revolutionized American dining with what the world believed were authentic recipes passed down through 5 generations of his distinguished Virginia family. His frozen meal lines, upscale restaurant chains, and specialty food products had made him the undisputed king of comfort food, worth $3.2 billion and growing. The mansion itself was a testament to old money and older lies. 17 bedrooms, 12 bathrooms, a ballroom that hadn't seen dancing in decades, and a kitchen so pristine it looked like it belonged in a magazine, rather than a home where people actually lived. Every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that only came from being unused. Every appliance bore the sheen of abandonment, disguised as luxury. For Isabella Vargas, the estate represented both salvation and suffocation. 2.5 years ago, her world had collapsed when her mother Elena succumbed to a rare autoimmune disease that had drained their family's savings, despite Isabella's master's degree in culinary arts from the Institute of Culinary Education. The medical bills had been crushing, the funeral expenses devastating, and the loss of her mother's small catering business had left Isabella with nothing but memories, recipes, and an impossible mountain of debt. The housekeeping position at the Blackstone estate had been her lifeline, a job that paid well enough to chip away at the debt, while allowing her to send money to her younger brother Miguel, who was finishing his engineering degree at UC Berkeley. It wasn't the career she'd dreamed of, but it was survival, and sometimes survival required swallowing your pride and polishing other people's marble countertops. The Blackstone family was a masterclass in dysfunction wrapped in designer clothing. Alexander's wife, Victoria, had walked out 8 months earlier after discovering his affair with his head of marketing, taking their 15-year-old son Christopher with her to their estate in the Hamptons. The divorce proceedings were vicious and public, splashed across business magazines and society pages with the kind of gleeful malice reserved for watching the mighty fall. Left behind in the echoing mansion was 8-year-old Sophia, a bright, sensitive child who had become collateral damage in her parents' war. Alexander, consumed by protecting his business empire from his estranged wife's legal maneuvers, had little time for parenting. The child was essentially being raised by a rotation of tutors, nannies and staff members, all of whom were too afraid of losing their jobs to form any real attachment to her. Isabella had watched Sophia retreat further into herself with each passing week. The little girl spent hours alone in her vast bedroom, surrounded by every expensive toy imaginable, but starved for the one thing money couldn't buy: genuine human connection. She rarely spoke during meals, picked at food prepared by the house's professional chef, and seemed to drift through the mansion like a small ghost haunting her own home. It was during one of these increasingly common episodes of childhood melancholy that everything changed forever. Thursday evening had arrived with the kind of cold rain that made the mansion feel even more isolated than usual. Alexander was in New York for a board meeting, The live-in chef had taken a rare night off, and the other staff members had retreated to their quarters. Isabella was finishing her evening cleaning routine when she heard soft crying coming from the kitchen. She found Sophia sitting on the cold marble floor, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs, homework papers scattered around her like fallen leaves. "Mija, what's wrong?" Isabella asked, using the Spanish endearment her own mother had used, as she knelt beside the child. Sophia looked up with red-rimmed eyes, clutching a worksheet that read Family Traditions Project across the top. "I can't do it," she whispered. "Mrs. Patterson wants us to write about a family recipe that's been passed down through generations, but we don't have any. Daddy just buys everything from restaurants or from his own company. I don't even know how to cook anything." Isabella's heart clenched as she looked at this privileged child who had everything except the things that truly mattered. Here was a little girl surrounded by luxury, but starving for the warmth of family tradition, the comfort of knowing where she came from, the simple joy of creating something with her own hands. "And everyone else in my class has these amazing stories," Sophia continued, her voice breaking. "Tommy's great-grandmother's apple pie recipe from Ireland, Sarah's family's secret barbecue sauce from Texas, Maria's abuela's mole that takes 3 days to make. I don't have anything like that. I don't have any stories." Without thinking, Isabella made a decision that would alter the trajectory of both their lives. "Come with me, Corazon," she said, helping Sophia to her feet. "Let me show you something special." Isabella led the child to her small staff quarters adjacent to the kitchen, where she kept her personal belongings in a modest but tidy room. From a carefully preserved wooden box that had belonged to her mother, she pulled out a worn leather journal filled with handwritten recipes in Spanish, some dating back nearly a century. "These," Isabella said softly, opening the journal to reveal pages of faded ink and careful annotations, "are my family's recipes. Some of them go back to my bisabuela, my great-great-grandmother, Esperanza Vargas. She came to America from Oaxaca, Mexico, in 1923, with nothing but the clothes on her back, and the knowledge passed down to her from her own grandmother." Sophia's eyes widened as she looked at the beautiful handwriting, the detailed notes in the margins, the small sketches that illustrated folding techniques and cooking methods. "She wrote all of this." "She did. And then she taught my great-grandmother, who taught my grandmother, who taught my mother, who taught me." Each generation added their own notes, their own improvements, their own love. Isabella's voice caught slightly as she thought of her mother, gone too soon, taking with her a lifetime of stories and wisdom. "Can you teach me one?" Sophia asked hesitantly. "For my project," Isabella smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in weeks. "How about we make tamales? It's something my family has been perfecting for almost 100 years." The transformation in Sophia was immediate and remarkable. As they returned to the pristine kitchen, the child's earlier sadness evaporated, replaced by curiosity and excitement. Isabella pulled ingredients from her personal supplies, masa harina, dried chiles, pork shoulder, she'd been planning to cook for herself over the weekend. "The secret to great tamales," Isabella explained as they worked, "isn't in expensive ingredients or fancy equipment. It's in the time you take, the love you put in, and the stories you tell while you're making them." She showed Sophia how to soak the corn husks, how to prepare the masa with just the right consistency, how to season the filling with a blend of spices that had been refined over generations. But more importantly, she shared the stories that went with each step. "My bisabuela Esperanza," Isabella said as they mixed the masa, "she used to say that you could taste whether someone made their tamales with love or just with hunger. The difference wasn't in the recipe, it was in the heart of the person making them." Sophia listened with rapt attention, her small hands eager to learn each technique. "What happened to her?" "Your bisabuela, she opened a small restaurant in Los Angeles in 1925, right in the heart of what would become East LA. It was called La Cocina de Esperanza. Esperanza's Kitchen. For 40 years she served food to immigrants who were homesick for the tastes of home, to families who wanted to celebrate their heritage, to anyone who walked through her doors hungry. Isabella's voice grew softer as she continued the story. She passed the restaurant to my great-grandmother Carmen, who ran it until the 1980s. Then it went to my grandmother Rosa, who had such a gift for spices that people would drive from 3 states away just to taste her mole poblano. What about your mom? Sophia asked, carefully spreading masa on a corn husk under Isabella's guidance. My mama, Isabella said, her voice thick with emotion. She tried to keep the tradition alive. After my grandmother passed, Mama took over the recipes, but by then the neighborhood was changing. Gentrification was pushing out the families who had been our customers for generations. She had to close the restaurant, but she started a catering business, still using all the old recipes, still keeping the traditions alive. They worked in comfortable companionship, as Isabella shared more stories, how her great-grandmother had survived the Depression by trading tamales for vegetables from local farmers, how her grandmother had hidden the family recipes when anti-Mexican sentiment was high in the 1950s, how her mother had dreamed of opening a cooking school to teach the old ways to new generations. Every recipe in that journal, Isabella said as they began folding the tamales with the distinctive technique her family had perfected, represents someone's life, someone's dreams, someone's determination to keep their culture alive in a new country. The tamales they were making looked perfect, the masa spread evenly, the filling perfectly seasoned, the folding technique creating the signature shape that Isabella's family had been known for. As they worked, neither of them noticed the sound of a car pulling into the circular driveway, or the front door opening, or the approaching footsteps on the marble floors. What the hell is going on in my kitchen? The voice cut through their comfortable bubble like a blade. Alexander Blackstone III stood in the doorway of his pristine kitchen, his expensive suit wrinkled from travel, his face a mask of exhaustion and irritation. His eyes took in the scene before him, his daughter covered in masa flour, his housekeeper teaching her to cook with ingredients that definitely didn't come from his chef's carefully curated pantry. Isabella's heart lurched as she recognized the look on her employer's face. It was the same expression she'd seen on countless faces throughout her life, the look of someone who viewed her culture, her traditions, her very existence as something foreign and unwelcome. Mr. Blackstone, she began, stepping slightly in front of Sophia, as if to shield the child from her father's anger. I'm sorry, I was just helping Sophia with a school project about making a mess in my kitchen. Alexander's voice was cold, controlled, the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. About teaching my daughter to play with food like some kind of peasant craft project. Sophia's face crumpled, the joy and excitement draining out of her like water from a broken vessel. Daddy, we were making tamales. Isabella was teaching me about her family's traditions, and I was going to write about them for school. And Isabella needs to remember that she's here to clean, not to fill your head with whatever this is. Alexander said, his gaze never leaving Isabella's face. And you need to understand that we have our own family traditions. We don't need to borrow from the help. The casual cruelty of the words hit Isabella like a physical blow, but what made it worse was the way Sophia flinched, the way the child seemed to fold in on herself as her father's rejection washed over her. Isabella had endured this kind of dismissal her entire life, the subtle and not so subtle ways that people made it clear that her culture, her heritage, her very identity, was somehow less valuable than theirs. But looking at Sophia's devastated face, something hardened inside Isabella. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a little girl who was being taught to reject warmth and connection in favor of cold, empty prestige. These aren't just whatever, Mr. Blackstone, Isabella said quietly, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "These are tamales made from a recipe that my family has been perfecting for nearly 100 years. Something flickered in Alexander's eyes, not quite recognition, but something close to it. His gaze shifted to the tamales cooling on the counter, and Isabella saw his expression change almost imperceptibly. 100 years, he repeated, his voice oddly flat. Yes, my great-great-grandmother, Esperanza Vargas, brought this recipe from Oaxaca to Los Angeles in 1923. She passed it to her daughter Carmen, who passed it to my grandmother Rosa, who taught my mother Elena, who taught me. It's been in my family for 5 generations. Isabella watched as the color slowly drained from Alexander's face. His eyes were fixed on the tamales with an intensity that seemed almost frantic. He moved closer to the counter, and she noticed that his hands were trembling slightly as he picked up one of the perfectly folded tamales. That's impossible, he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Isabella frowned, confused by his strange reaction. Mr. Blackstone, what's impossible? But Alexander wasn't listening to her question. He was staring at the tamale in his hands as if he'd seen a ghost. The distinctive folding pattern, the perfect proportion of masa to filling, the way the corn husk was tied, it was identical to the signature style that had launched Heritage Foods International's most successful product line 15 years ago. Because 15 years ago, Alexander Blackstone had been a failing businessman whose restaurant ventures had collapsed, whose family fortune was nearly depleted by his father's gambling debts and his own poor investments. He had been 6 months away from bankruptcy when a private investigator he'd hired had tracked down the family of Carmen Vargas, an elderly woman who had owned a small restaurant in East Los Angeles that had closed due to gentrification and family financial troubles. Carmen had been desperate. Her husband was dying of cancer. Her daughter Elena was struggling to keep a catering business afloat while caring for him, and they needed money fast. Alexander had offered to buy not just recipes, but the entire culinary legacy of the Vargas family, their techniques, their stories, their heritage, for a sum that seemed enormous to a desperate family, but was a fraction of what those recipes would eventually be worth. He had rebranded their authentic Mexican cuisine as Heritage Foods, implying his own Virginia heritage, rather than theirs. He had hired food scientists to reverse engineer their traditional techniques for mass production. He had taken their family stories and rewritten them as tales of his own ancestors, creating a fictional narrative about his great-grandmother's recipes from the old country. Most crucially, he had made Carmen and her family sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that prevented them from ever claiming credit for their own recipes, their own techniques, their own heritage. They were legally bound to silence about their role in building his empire, and they had received only a one-time payment while he built a billion-dollar business on their stolen legacy. Carmen Vargas had died 2 years after the sale, never knowing that her family's recipes would make another man a billionaire. Her daughter Elena had struggled with the catering business until her illness finally forced her to close it entirely. And now, standing in his kitchen, was Elena's daughter, carrying the same knowledge, the same techniques, the same love that had been in those original recipes. "Where did you say your grandmother's restaurant was?" Alexander asked, his voice barely audible. "Los Angeles, East LA specifically. It was called La Cocina de Esperanza, but later my great-grandmother Carmen took it over and renamed it Vargas Family Kitchen. She ran it until the early 2000s, when..." Isabella's voice trailed off as she noticed Alexander's expression. He looked like he might be sick. "Vargas Family Kitchen," he repeated, and the words sounded like a confession falling from his lips. "You knew my family's restaurant?" Isabella asked, her heart beginning to race with a mixture of hope and fear. Alexander stared at her with the expression of a man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time. "What was your mother's name?" "Elena. Elena Vargas. She tried to keep the catering business going," after my great-grandmother couldn't run the restaurant anymore, but it was hard, and when she got sick." Isabella stopped, studying Alexander's face. "Mr. Blackstone, why are you asking me these questions? Did you know my mother?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Sophia looked back and forth between the adults, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. The tamales sat cooling on the counter, innocent evidence of a crime that had been hidden for 15 years. Alexander Blackstone, food empire mogul and respected businessman, stood frozen in his own kitchen, holding a tamale that looked exactly like the ones that had made him rich. In that moment, he wasn't a titan of industry. He was a thief who had just come face to face with his victim's daughter. "Isabella," Sophia said, tugging on her apron, oblivious to the seismic shift happening in the room. "Can we finish the tamales? I want to write about your bisabuela for my project." But Isabella wasn't looking at Sophia anymore. She was staring at Alexander Blackstone, seeing not an employer but a man with a terrible secret written across his face. A man who had gone pale at the mention of her family's restaurant, who had reacted to their recipes like someone confronting a ghost from his past. "Mr. Blackstone," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the storm of realization building inside her, "I think you need to tell me how you really knew my family." The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of an antique grandfather clock in the hallway, and the sound of Alexander Blackstone's empire beginning to crumble around him. Because Isabella Vargas wasn't just his housekeeper, she was the rightful heir to the recipes that had built his fortune, the granddaughter of the woman he had deceived, the daughter of the family he had reduced to silence and poverty, while building his billions on their stolen heritage. And she was about to discover just how far a desperate man had gone to bury the truth about the source of his success. When Isabella Vargas recognized the shock on her employer's face as she mentioned her family's restaurant, she knew something was terribly wrong. Alexander Blackstone's reaction to her grandmother's recipes wasn't surprise, it was guilt. Now, as she stands in his marble kitchen holding the tamale that launched his billion-dollar empire, Isabella is about to discover that her family's stolen legacy runs deeper than she ever imagined, and the price of reclaiming it might cost her everything. The silence in the Blackstone kitchen stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Alexander stood frozen, the damning tamale still clutched in his trembling hands, while Isabella's mind raced to connect pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed until this moment. "Mr. Blackstone," Isabella said again, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "how did you know my family's restaurant?" Alexander's eyes darted towards Sophia, who was watching the exchange with growing confusion, then back to Isabella. The calculating businessman was warring with the cornered criminal inside him, and Isabella could see both struggling for control. "Sophia," he said finally, his voice strained, "go to your room, now." "But Daddy, we're not finished with the tamales, now." Alexander's voice exploded through the kitchen, causing both Sophia and Isabella to flinch. The little girl's face crumpled with hurt and confusion, but she obediently gathered her homework and fled, casting one last longing look at the unfinished cooking project that had brought her such rare joy. When they were alone, Alexander slowly set the tamale down on the counter, as if it might burn him. He walked to the kitchen's floor-to-ceiling windows and stared out at the city lights below, his shoulders rigid with tension. "You want to know how I knew your family's restaurant?" he said without turning around. "I bought it. I bought everything. The recipes, the techniques, the stories, all of it." Isabella felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet. "What do you mean you bought it?" Alexander finally turned to face her, and she was struck by how much older he looked than he had just minutes before. The confident businessman had been replaced by a haunted man, carrying the weight of 15 years of lies. "15 years ago, I was broke," he began, his voice flat and emotionless. "Not just struggling, completely ruined. My family's money was gone, squandered by my father's gambling and my own arrogant investment decisions. I had 6 months before I'd lose everything, including this house that had been in our family for 3 generations. He moved to the kitchen island, placing his hands flat on the marble surface, as if to steady himself. I was desperate, Isabella, desperate enough to hire a private investigator to track down family-owned restaurants that were failing, places where I might be able to buy recipes cheaply before someone else discovered their value. Isabella's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. And you found my family. I found your great-grandmother Carmen. She was 78, trying to care for a husband dying of cancer, while your mother Elena struggled to keep a catering business alive. They were drowning in medical bills, facing foreclosure on the small house Carmen had bought with 40 years of restaurant profits. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Isabella remembered those final years of her great-grandmother's life, the stress and fear that had aged her rapidly, the way she'd spoken bitterly about having to sell the family's soul to pay for medical care. How much? Isabella whispered. $250,000, Alexander said, and the number hit Isabella like a physical blow. It seemed like a fortune to them at the time, enough to pay off the medical bills, cover the funeral expenses when your great-grandfather passed, and keep your mother's catering business afloat for a few more years. Isabella's hands clenched into fists. $250,000 for recipes that had generated billions. It was the ultimate con, taking advantage of a desperate family's crisis to steal their entire culinary heritage for pennies on the dollar. But it wasn't just about buying recipes, was it? She said, her voice growing stronger with anger. You made them sign something that prevented them from ever telling anyone what you'd done. Alexander nodded grimly. A comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. They couldn't claim credit for the recipes, couldn't discuss the sale, couldn't even mention that they'd ever known me. If they violated it, they'd have to pay back the money plus massive penalties they could never afford. You silenced them. You bought their silence along with their legacy. I bought their survival. Alexander shot back, some of his old arrogance flaring. Your family was going under anyway. At least this way, they got something out of it. Isabella felt rage building in her chest like a fire. They got something. You built a $3 billion empire on my family's work, and you think $250,000 was fair compensation. You turned our heritage into your fortune, and erased our name from history. I turned failing recipes into a global brand. I took techniques that were rotting in a dying neighborhood, and shared them with the world. Your family could never have achieved what I achieved with those recipes. The casual racism and classism in his words made Isabella's vision blur with fury, but she forced herself to stay focused. Getting angry wouldn't help her now. She needed information. Tell me exactly what you bought from them, she demanded. Alexander walked to a built-in cabinet and pulled out a key. He unlocked a drawer. Isabella had cleaned hundreds of times, but never been able to open, and withdrew a thick manila folder. Everything, he said, spreading the contents across the counter. 137 recipes, including preparation techniques, ingredient sourcing notes, and family stories that I used to create the Heritage Foods brand narrative. Traditional tamales, mole poblano, pozole, elote, churros, everything that became our signature products. Isabella stared at photocopies of her family's handwritten recipes, some in her great-grandmother's careful script, others in her grandmother Rosa's flowing cursive. Seeing them laid out like stolen treasure made her feel sick. And these, she asked, pointing to what looked like legal documents, the contracts, the NDAs, proof of payment, all completely legal and binding. Alexander's voice had regained some of its confidence. Your family made a deal, Isabella. They were compensated fairly for the time and circumstances. Isabella laughed bitterly. Fairly? You exploited a family in crisis, stole their cultural heritage, and then legally silenced them so they couldn't even tell their own story. And you call that fair? I call it business. You call it theft. Isabella pulled out her phone and began photographing the documents spread across the counter. And I'm going to prove it. Alexander lunged forward, trying to grab her phone. You can't do that. Those are private business documents. Isabella dodged away, continuing to photograph everything she could see. Private documents about my own family's stolen recipes. I don't think so. Isabella, listen to me, Alexander said, his tone shifting to something that might have been pleading. Your family is bound by those NDAs. If you go public with this, if you try to claim credit for those recipes, you'll destroy them financially. The penalty clauses alone would bankrupt what's left of your family. Isabella paused, her finger hovering over her phone's camera button. What do you mean, what's left of my family? Alexander's expression grew darker. Your mother's catering business, your brother's college tuition, the monthly payments I've been making to cover your mother's medical expenses even after she stopped working. Did you think all of that was just charity? The revelation hit Isabella like a sledgehammer. The mysterious medical coverage that had allowed her mother to receive experimental treatments, the scholarship fund that had suddenly appeared to help Miguel finish his engineering degree, the financial assistance that had kept their family afloat during the worst of her mother's illness. It had all come from Alexander Blackstone. You've been paying for our medical bills, she whispered. I've been honoring my agreement with your family, Alexander said coldly. The original contract included provisions for ongoing medical support and educational assistance. It wasn't charity, it was part of the deal. Isabella felt the world spinning around her. Every aspect of her family's survival over the past decade had been orchestrated by the man who had stolen their heritage. They had been unwitting dependents of their own victimizer. You son of a bitch, she breathed. You made sure we'd never be able to fight back. You made us dependent on you. I made sure your family was taken care of, Alexander countered. Your mother received the best medical care money could buy. Your brother is graduating from one of the top engineering schools in the country. You think any of that would have been possible if I'd left your family's recipes to molder in obscurity? Isabella wanted to scream, to throw something, to physically attack the man who had so systematically destroyed and controlled her family's life. But another part of her, the part trained in business strategy during her culinary arts program, was already calculating the implications. The NDAs, she said slowly, they bound my great-grandmother and my mother, but not me. Alexander's face went pale. Isabella, don't be foolish. You have nothing to gain and everything to lose. I can make your life very difficult if you try to fight me. You mean more difficult than working as a housekeeper while holding a master's degree in culinary arts? More difficult than watching my mother die from an illness we couldn't afford to treat properly? More difficult than seeing my family's legacy stolen and perverted into your fake heritage story? Isabella continued photographing documents, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. You know what I think, Mr. Blackstone? I think you're terrified. I think you know that your entire empire is built on lies, and you're afraid of what happens when the truth comes out. The truth? Alexander's voice rose to a shout. The truth is that I turned your family's small-time recipes into a global phenomenon. The truth is that billions of people have enjoyed food based on your heritage because of what I built. The truth is that I've employed thousands of people and created more value from those recipes than your family could have created in 10 generations. The truth, Isabella said quietly, is that you stole from a desperate family and built your fortune on our graves. The truth is that you've been controlling us for 15 years, making sure we stayed poor and dependent so we could never challenge you. The truth is that Heritage Foods is a lie, and Alexander Blackstone is a fraud. She finished photographing the last document and tucked her phone safely into her pocket. And now I'm going to prove it to the world. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, and Isabella saw something dangerous flicker in his eyes. "You have no idea what you're up against," he said softly. "I have lawyers who could tie you up in court for decades. I have enough money to destroy your reputation, your brother's career, your entire family's future. I can make you disappear, Isabella, like you made my family disappear from the story of their own recipes. I'm warning you, walk away, take your job, take the medical coverage, take the quiet life I've provided for your family, and walk away, because if you don't I will crush you so completely that you'll wish you'd never learned to cook." Isabella met his gaze steadily. "You know what the difference is between you and me, Mr. Blackstone. You fight with lawyers and money and legal contracts. I fight with the truth, and the truth is a lot more powerful than you think." She turned and walked toward the kitchen door, then paused and looked back at him one final time. "Oh, and Mr. Blackstone, I quit. Find someone else to clean up your messes." Isabella spent the night in her small apartment, poring over the photographs she'd taken and researching everything she could find about Alexander Blackstone's rise to fortune. What she discovered made her stomach turn. Heritage Foods International had been built on what Blackstone claimed was his great-grandmother's traditional Virginia recipes, passed down through 5 generations of his distinguished family. The company's marketing materials were filled with stories about his ancestors' struggle as immigrants from Eastern Europe, their determination to preserve their culinary traditions, their gradual integration into American society through food. Every single word was a lie. Alexander Blackstone's real great-grandmother had been a wealthy socialite, who had never cooked a meal in her life. His family's fortune had come from tobacco and textiles, not food. He had fabricated an entire heritage story to sell mass-produced versions of Isabella's family's authentic Mexican recipes. But Isabella knew she couldn't fight him alone. She needed help, and she knew exactly where to find it. Marcus Rivera had been Isabella's study partner in culinary school, a brilliant chef who had specialized in food history and cultural cuisine. After graduation, he had become an investigative food journalist, exposing fraud and cultural appropriation in the culinary world. If anyone would understand the significance of what Alexander had done, it would be Marcus. Isabella called him at 6 in the morning, knowing he'd be awake preparing for his morning cooking show on YouTube. "Isabella, what's wrong? You sound terrible." "Marcus, I need your help. I've discovered something that's going to blow up the entire food industry." She spent 20 minutes explaining everything: the stolen recipes, the fake heritage story, the systematic exploitation of her family. Marcus listened without interruption, and she could practically hear his journalistic instincts kicking into high gear. "Isabella, this is massive. If you can prove what you're claiming, this could bring down one of the biggest food companies in America. But you're right, you can't do this alone. Blackstone will have a team of lawyers on you before you can blink." "What do you think I should do?" "First, we need more evidence. What you have is good, but we need witnesses, documentation, proof that your family's recipes are identical to Heritage Foods products. Second, we need to make this story too big to suppress. Blackstone can silence one person, but he can't silence the entire internet." Marcus arrived at Isabella's apartment that afternoon with a laptop, professional camera equipment, and a determination that matched her own. They spent hours documenting everything: the original recipes from Isabella's mother's journal, the photographs of Blackstone's stolen documents, the timeline of events that showed how Heritage Foods' success directly correlated with the purchase of her family's recipes. But their biggest breakthrough came when Marcus suggested they contact other families who might have been victimized the same way. "If Blackstone did this to your family," Marcus reasoned, "he probably did it to others. Men like him don't commit crimes just once. They perfect a system and repeat it." Their research uncovered a disturbing pattern. Over the course of a decade, Alexander Blackstone had systematically targeted struggling immigrant-owned restaurants and food businesses, buying their recipes and techniques for minimal compensation while binding the families to strict NDAs. Italian grandmothers, Chinese families, Indian spice merchants, dozens of families had been stripped of their culinary heritage so that Alexander Blackstone could build his empire. Most damning of all, they discovered that many of these families had died without ever knowing their recipes had made another man a billionaire. The NDAs had been so comprehensive that surviving family members often didn't even know about the sales. Isabella felt sick as the scope of Alexander's crimes became clear. This wasn't just theft, it was cultural genocide, the systematic erasure of immigrant contributions to American cuisine in favor of a false narrative about white heritage and success. "We need to go public," Marcus said after they'd compiled their evidence. "But we need to do it right. One massive exposé that tells the whole story and gives these families their voices back." Marcus worked through the night, crafting an article that would serve as a digital bomb. He titled it "The Heritage Lie: How America's Beloved Food Empire Was Built on Stolen Recipes and Silenced Families." But before they published anything, Isabella made one final decision. She called Sophia Blackstone. The little girl answered her father's phone with confusion and hope in her voice. "Isabella, Daddy said you didn't work for us anymore. I was so sad about the tamales." "Mija, listen to me carefully. I need you to know something important about those recipes I showed you. They weren't just my family's recipes, they're some of the same recipes your father's company uses. Do you understand what that means?" There was a long pause. "You mean Daddy's company uses your bisabuela's recipes?" "Yes, corazón. And he never gave my family credit for them. He told the world they were his family's recipes instead." Another pause, longer this time. When Sophia spoke again, her voice was small and uncertain. "Does that mean Daddy stole them?" Isabella's heart broke for the child who was about to learn a terrible truth about her father. "Yes, Mija, that's exactly what it means." "That's not fair," Sophia whispered. "No, it's not, but I'm going to try to make it right. And I want you to know that no matter what happens, you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes adults make bad choices, but that doesn't mean the children are responsible for them." After ending the call, Isabella felt a mixture of sadness and resolve. Sophia would be hurt by what was coming, but the truth needed to be told. Marcus published his exposé on a Thursday morning, simultaneously releasing it on his popular YouTube channel, his food blog, and sending copies to major news outlets. The response was immediate and explosive. Within hours, #Heritage Hoax was trending worldwide. Food bloggers, chefs and cultural activists shared the story across every platform. The families Marcus and Isabella had identified began coming forward with their own stories, adding their voices to a growing chorus of outrage. Heritage Foods International stock price plummeted. The company's board of directors called an emergency meeting. Media vans surrounded the Blackstone estate, but Alexander Blackstone wasn't finished fighting. Isabella's phone rang at midnight on Friday, exactly 48 hours after the story broke. "You have 12 hours to retract your story and issue a public apology." Alexander's voice was cold with controlled fury. "If you don't, I will destroy you and everyone you care about." "It's too late for threats," Isabella replied. "The truth is out there now. You can't put it back in the bottle, can't I? Let's see. Your brother Miguel, did you know he's been accepted to a graduate program in robotics at Stanford? Very prestigious, very expensive." It would be a shame if questions arose about his undergraduate scholarship, if investigations were launched into the legitimacy of his financial aid. Academic fraud is a serious crime. Isabella's blood ran cold, but she kept her voice steady. Miguel earned every grade, every scholarship on his own merit. But can you prove that? Can you prove that none of the funding that helped him succeed came from questionable sources? My lawyers are very good at creating doubt, at making clean records look suspicious. They could tie him up in legal proceedings for years. You bastard. And your mother's medical records. Did you know that experimental treatments sometimes involve drugs that aren't fully FDA approved? If someone were to suggest that her doctors had prescribed unapproved medications, if someone were to question whether proper protocols were followed, Isabella realized she was shaking with rage and fear. Even from his position of defeat, Alexander was finding ways to threaten her family. You're a monster, she whispered. I'm a businessman protecting his interests. You have 12 hours, Isabella. Retract your story, or watch your family's world collapse around them. But Alexander Blackstone had made one crucial miscalculation. He had spent so many years believing that money and power could solve any problem that he had forgotten the most important lesson of all. Sometimes people refuse to be intimidated. Isabella hung up the phone and immediately called Marcus. He's threatening my family, she said without preamble. He says he'll destroy my brother's academic career and go after my mother's medical care. Then we go nuclear, Marcus replied grimly. I've been holding back some information, waiting for the right moment. I think that moment just arrived. What information? Blackstone's threats against other families. I've found evidence that he's used similar intimidation tactics before, threatening deportation, questioning legal status, creating financial hardship for anyone who tried to speak out against him. It's all part of a pattern of systematic oppression designed to keep his victims silent. Marcus worked through the night again, this time preparing a follow-up article that exposed Alexander's intimidation tactics alongside audio recordings from 3 other families who had finally found the courage to speak out about their experiences. The second article hit like a tsunami. Now it wasn't just about stolen recipes, it was about a powerful billionaire using systematic intimidation to silence immigrant families and steal their cultural heritage. Federal investigators announced they were opening a formal investigation into Heritage Foods International's business practices. State attorneys general began examining whether the company had violated consumer protection laws by falsely advertising its products' origins. Most importantly, the story had grown beyond Alexander Blackstone's ability to control it. It had become a symbol of how immigrant contributions to American culture were often ignored, stolen or erased by those with more power and privilege. The legal battles took months, but the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. Heritage Foods International's sales plummeted as consumers rejected products they now knew were built on lies. Restaurant chains dropped Heritage Foods products from their menus. Major retailers removed the company's items from their shelves. Alexander Blackstone was forced to resign as CEO, though he fought to maintain control of the company through legal maneuvers and proxy battles. The board of directors, facing potential personal liability, eventually voted to remove him entirely and begin the process of restructuring the company. But the real victory came when the families whose recipes had been stolen were finally able to tell their stories. Carmen Moraes, Isabella's great-grandmother, had died never knowing that her recipes would feed millions of people around the world. But her legacy lived on in her great-granddaughter's determination to reclaim their family's heritage. Isabella Vargas, Isabella's mother, had lived to see her daughter's triumph. Weak from her long illness but fierce with pride, she appeared in a televised interview where she demonstrated the authentic techniques that had been stolen from her family. "My mother and grandmother always said that food is love made visible," Elena said as she shaped masa for tamales with hands that shook but had lost none of their skill. "Alexander Blackstone stole our recipes, but he could never steal the love we put into them. That belongs to our family alone." Isabella became the face of a movement for culinary justice, advocating for better protections for traditional recipes and family food heritage. She testified before Congress about the need for legislation protecting cultural cuisine from appropriation and exploitation. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came 6 months after the story broke, when Isabella received an unexpected visitor. Sophia Blackstone, now 9 years old, stood at Isabella's apartment door, holding a small suitcase and accompanied by a social worker. "My daddy's in jail," Sophia said matter-of-factly, "and Mommy says I can't live with her right now because she's in rehab. But I remembered what you said about family not always being about blood, and I wondered, could you teach me to make those tamales again? The real way this time." Isabella knelt down to Sophia's eye level, her heart breaking for this child who had lost everything but was still brave enough to reach out for connection. "Of course, Mia," Isabella said, opening her arms. "Family is about the people who choose to love you, and I choose you." 1 year later, Isabella stood in the kitchen of her new restaurant, Esperanza's Legacy, watching as Miguel helped Sofia measure masa harina for their evening's tamale special. The restaurant was small but always full, serving authentic versions of the recipes that had once made Alexander Blackstone rich. But this time, the story being told was the true one. The walls were covered with photographs of Isabella's family, Esperanza, Carmen, Rosa, Elena, alongside stories of their journey from Mexico to America, their struggles and triumphs, their determination to preserve their heritage through food. The restaurant had become a gathering place for the families whose recipes had been stolen by heritage foods. They came to share their stories, to teach their children the traditions that had nearly been lost, to celebrate the heritage that no amount of money or legal contracts could truly steal. Isabella Vargas sat at her usual table by the window, stronger now and surrounded by the laughter of children learning to cook the recipes she had feared would die with her. Her hands, guided by muscle memory that transcended illness, still moved with grace as she showed young Sophia the secret to perfect empanada dough. "The love is in the hands," she told the little girl, just as her own grandmother had told her decades before. "You can't teach love. It has to grow in the heart first." Isabella watched her makeshift family with wonder and gratitude. Alexander Blackstone had tried to steal their heritage, but in the end, he had only succeeded in bringing them together. Sophia had legally become Isabella's ward after both her parents proved unfit, and the little girl had blossomed in an environment where her curiosity and sensitivity were treasured rather than ignored. The money from the legal settlement, Heritage Foods had eventually agreed to pay reparations to the families whose recipes they had stolen, had allowed Isabella to open the restaurant and establish a foundation to support immigrant-owned food businesses. But the real treasure wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that her great-great-grandmother's recipes were finally being served with the proper recognition and respect they deserved. It was the sight of children learning their cultural heritage through cooking, just as Isabella had learned from her mother. It was the understanding that food was never just about nutrition. It was about identity, memory, love, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us to our ancestors and each other. Alexander Blackstone sat in minimum security federal prison, serving a sentence for fraud, tax evasion, and intimidation of witnesses. Heritage Foods International had been dissolved, its assets distributed among the families it had wronged. The man who had once commanded billions found himself with nothing but time to contemplate the empire he had built on lies and lost through his own arrogance. But in the kitchen of Esperanza's legacy, surrounded by the warmth of genuine family and authentic heritage, Isabella Vargas had found something far more valuable than any corporate empire. She had found her true calling, not as someone who cleaned up other people's messes, but as someone who helped preserve and celebrate the beautiful complexity of immigrant culture in America. As she watched Sophia carefully fold her first perfect tamale, using techniques passed down through 5 generations of Vargas women, Isabella smiled and whispered a prayer of gratitude to her bisabuela Esperanza. The recipes had finally come home. 5 years after the Heritage Foods scandal broke, Isabella Vargas was featured on the cover of Food and Wine magazine as one of America's most influential chefs and restaurateurs. Her cookbook, Reclaiming Our Heritage, The True Stories Behind America's Favorite Foods, had become a bestseller and sparked a national conversation about cultural appropriation in cuisine. But on quiet Thursday evenings, when the restaurant was closed and the city had grown still, Isabella could still be found in her kitchen teaching Sophia the finer points of mole poblano, or explaining to Miguel why the order of ingredients mattered when making perfect masa. In those moments, surrounded by the ghost of her ancestors' love and the promise of the traditions she was passing to the next generation, Isabella knew that some recipes were worth more than any fortune. They were worth fighting for, protecting and sharing with the world, but only when the world was ready to honor their true origins. The recipe that had changed everything wasn't just about food. It was about justice, heritage, and the unbreakable power of family, both the one you're born into and the one you choose to create.